This episode of the Move Mind podcast was brought to you by CBD Mountain, the sport and fitness CBD. Head over to cbdmountain.com for a range of soft gels, skin balms, oils and vapes, and purchase online and have the premium quality CBD delivered directly to your door. cbdmountain.com. Thanks for tuning into the Move Mind podcast. My guest today is Robert Degle, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belt under John Danaher and also a coach in Singapore. Rob, thanks for coming on, mate. Thanks for waking up nice and early.
Yeah, no worries, man. As long as I have my coffee, I can get through anything in the morning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm actually got a cup of tea here as well on the go.
Yeah,
Cheers. So how are you finding Singapore? How long have you been out there now, and how's it going settling in with the crazy culture shift?
yeah. Well, so I got here February, late February, and so I had quarantine for 2 weeks, obviously, which was pretty boring. But then after that, if you count that, then I guess like a month and a half. But if you don't count that, then like a month, right? Because it's funny, when I was in quarantine, I was like, I'm not really like in Singapore yet, because I was
Right.
just confined to a room. But like, yeah, so I guess like a month and a half, depending on how you define it. And it's interesting that you ask about the culture shock, because Singapore is a funny place because it's a very unique country. This is a part of what I like about it, actually. It's obviously Asian, but it's also very Western. Like,
Sure.
Singapore is very upfront about its colonial heritage. Like, they champion it. Like, they're like not ashamed of it whatsoever, right? Like, it's like a part of their cultural identity, and like and that carries over to their culture too, in a sense, because obviously it's an English speaking country. That's their like sort of official political and business language. That was a very deliberate move on their part. It was very smart. The one of the main leaders of the country, Lee Kuan Yew. It was a deliberate move in order to help them do well on the international stage. Let's have everyone speak English, right? Because it's undeniably English is the pretty much the sort of lingua franca of the world,
Yeah.
and so that was a move on his part, which was, I think, very good. And because it was a former English colony, a lot of people already spoke it. It wasn't like a hard transition or anything. So in so many ways, it's very Western, but obviously it still is Asia.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure there are small things that I don't even notice that are like cultural differences that I'm not really picking up on. Maybe the longer I'm here, the longer I'll see it.
Sure.
But yeah, it's funny. Sometimes I like when I was traveling Asia and I was in like Taiwan, Thailand, Malaysia, these places very different. You're like constantly aware I'm not in a Western country. Singapore, man, honestly, I got off the train the other day on my way to training and I was thinking to myself, oh yeah, I'm in Asia. Like it's that thought dawned on me for a second, because sometimes it's so easy to forget because there's English everywhere. There's like McDonald's and 7-Eleven, and you know what I mean. Like it's so Western in a sense that you forget. Yeah. So yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally, mate. It totally is. It's probably one of the most westernized sort of Asian countries there is, right? Like they're renowned as being an expat kind of haven, and you get loads of people from all over the world working there, right? I knew a guy at my last gym in the UK who went out there to run a sort of S&C CrossFit facility there, and yeah, he just slipped straight into the way of life there. It was a pretty seamless transition. That's good. I'm glad you've kind of blended in easily there. Culture shocks are great, but sometimes it's nice just to hit the ground running, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big part of why I liked it here. You know what I mean? Like, so for instance, Singapore is a place where I think it's easy to just kind of blend in, like, you know what I mean? Pretty much no matter what your background is, a lot like New York in that sense. Some places, obviously, I would have stood in Asia, that is, I would have stood out like a sore thumb, right? If I moved to Taiwan, right? Obviously, I'm going to be more notable. And I don't really want to stand out that much, right? So I prefer that of Singapore, like,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, absolutely. But there's one thing they haven't got, right, and that's decent New York Italian pizza.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess so. How do you deal with the withdrawals, mate? Because I'm a massive pizza head, and I need it at least weekly.
Yeah, no, man, it's pretty bad. I was joking around with you before the we started recording. I barely consider it pizza. It is like pretty bad. But like to be honest, it's like it's fair. You know what I mean? Like the Indian food out here is way better than the Indian food you get in the U.S.
Oh, I bet.
I would say, yeah, I would say my favorite food in the world is Indian food, not in any order. Indian food and pizza. Those are probably my two favorite. As you can see, I'm like very refined. My taste.
Cuisine there, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
lovely. The gains cometh. Do
right.
you like rendang? Can you get rendang out there, like the rendang curries?
Uh,
Have you tried
to
any of
be
those? A
honest,
bit more Malaysian, but amazing.
okay. So what's funny is I love Indian food, but I don't know what much of it is called other than like the basic stuff. Like I know like dosa, prata,
Oh, yeah,
naan, like that. But like once you get to like a higher level, I'm like, oh, yeah, that thing
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Like,
Point and shoot. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
good. It's good food. I imagine it's really, really clean and amazing out there. So yeah, get get your body weight's worth as much as you can, I'd say.
right.
Rob, I want to take it back a little bit to your philosophy background.
Mhm.
People may or may not know that you were a philosophy major at City University of New York, Queen's College. Is that correct?
Yes,
Once,
yes.
once upon a time. And it seems like you get two types of people attracted to philosophy: those who are completely avoiding life and bumming around, and those who really want to get the most out of living. I don't know if that's a fair statement, but it seems kind of those two kind of categories. What was it that drew you to want to study philosophy in the first place? Maybe even before your jiu-jitsu started taking off.
Well, so it's funny because in a certain sense, I think I was both of those people. Like I'll talk about what initially pushed me into philosophy in a second, but I'll comment on that because I do think it is a fairly accurate observation. I remember like I was originally applying to PhD programs and I was sort of going down that route, and like honestly, a big part of it was I was like, I don't know, I guess this is like something I like. I'll pursue this with my life. Like, I feel like a lot of people kind of fall into that. You know what I mean? Like, it's like I had a professor who I was very good friends with, and he told me he was like, "Yeah, I went to grad school because I wasn't good at anything else. Now I'm teaching." And it's like, yeah, this is it's not a bad thing per se. It's just sort of how things go sometimes. But so what led me to philosophy? So my favorite philosopher, is like anyone who follows me knows at this point, is Ludwig Wittgenstein. I really love Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein. It's interesting. He describes philosophy as attacking him. So what he means by that is like it was almost like this annoyance in his life that he wished he didn't have to deal with, but he had like these constant irritations, almost like itches that he had to scratch, right? And so I actually feel like I experienced philosophy in a very similar way. So when I was young, I don't know, like anyone, I was very curious. So I used to just ask a lot of questions. One time, I'll never forget this. I think I was in Disney World and I was on one of the rides, and the ride broke down temporarily. So it's a pretty common occurrence at theme parks, right? So I was sitting there on the ride, and there was a lot of colors, and I remember thinking to myself, I was maybe like 12. I remember thinking to myself, how do I know that my what I perceive to be blue is what you perceive to be blue? Because our whole lives we would have grown up calling the same shade of color blue, and so there would have been a commonality there. But it's possible that I you see it as green and I see it as what I see as blue. You get what I'm saying? Like
Absolutely.
there would be how would we tell? Because you can't get outside of your perception and I can't get outside of mine. Now I know there's actually an answer to that question. Wittgenstein gives, I think, a very good answer to that question, which is that ultimately it doesn't matter because the meaning of a word is its use in language, and therefore uh, the cooperative benefit we gain from using the term blue in a communicative setting, basically, that is all we need to know about the word. So if it gets the job done insofar as helping us cooperate to towards common goals, that we don't like there's no sense in which we need to like probe deeper than that, and some people find that inadequate, and I understand that, but for me that answer is like very very adequate. So it's a very lengthy topic to get into that. But anyway, that's just like a brief sort of.
Yeah, no, you've done well to summarize Wittgenstein into about under 2 minutes there, considering the reading list I've heard you talk about before, which would take more than you said. I think I'm going to butcher your quote, but it was something along the lines of you could only really ever be an expert in one philosopher in a lifetime. There's no way. I think a teacher told you that. There's no way over like an entire lifetime you could get every philosopher's ideas compacted down. So yeah, you've done quite well to crunch Wittgenstein down there. So I want to come to nomenclature later as it regards to jiu-jitsu, but it sounds like there really nomenclature is the purpose of communication more than actually unpacking the word any further than it needs to be. It's like you say, it's a cooperative, communicative thing that the word allows.
Yeah. So okay. So basically, there are different theories of language. Obviously, right? Let's look at two very big ones. And I think that people oftentimes accidentally fall into one of them that I'm going to mention. So we can view this theory of language as being the picture theory of language, where people oftentimes think it sort of goes back to Plato and the theory of the forms, where you have this idea that you have a word and it stands for an object in the world, and there's a correlation between these two things, and that whenever you say the word, the object is like connected to the word, sort of by some inherent connection, if you will, right? Now, that's a very natural and somewhat obvious way to think of words, but I think, in fact, that's not really how words are used. So, for instance, this is just a single example. Imagine I had a dog and his name was Blue. And I go, come on, Blue, let's go, Blue. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about the color, right? And now what people can say is they can say, well, that's just another object to which connects the word blue. The problem with that is that can go on like indefinitely. Do we have millions of that, right? And they could say, yes, we do. Okay, fair enough. I think, however, if you understand, when I say blue, I'm not pointing to a representation. The word isn't a representation of something in the world. The word is, in a sense, it's a gesture, and the purpose of the gesture is to communicate something to someone else so that we can cooperate towards a common goal. So ultimately, Wittgenstein and certain other philosophers, I actually think it's funny. I think my coach and my way of thinking falls in line with this. It's more so about solving problems than it's about identifying and solving problems cooperatively, more so than it is about identifying truth. And that sounds like it sounds like wishy-washy, right? Because so what I mean is like the picture theory of language, what that attempts to do is for that to be true, they need for every single thing in the world, they need to have a word that stands for it, that doesn't stand for other things. It can stand for other things, but it can't stand for everything. Does that make sense? Right? Like the word, there has to be a limit to the number of things that the word can stand for. So, like a classic paradox of this theory of language is called it's called the Barber's paradox. Right? Imagine a town where everyone in town was legally required to shave. Okay, I wouldn't do well there. And now let's also imagine that it's also illegal to shave yourself, right? You can't shave yourself. So, and there's only one barber in the town. So how does he shave himself, right? He can't. He's automatically breaking the law. So Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein's mentor, he identified this problem, and it's called the set problem. Right, so if we imagine the color blue or the term blue, we could say that's a set. The term blue is a set for all the things to which the term corresponds, right? So the dog blue, the color blue, whatever else it would be, I don't know, right? So you've got all these things that are in the set blue. Okay, so if every term has to correspond to an object in the world, where do we find the set of all sets that do not belong to themselves? Okay, so it's the set of all sets that do not belong to themselves. There are going to be lots of sets in there, but there's going to be a set that doesn't have a set then. So it's like, so basically the point was Russell identified this problem and he attempted to have Wittgenstein, his best student, solve it. Wittgenstein tried to solve it, and then Wittgenstein actually concluded, no, actually it can't be solved. Our theory is fundamentally wrong. And then he shifted into the meaning theory of language, which is that the meaning of a word is not to stand for an object in the world, but rather to help us communicate cooperatively. And then it's much more complicated than that, but that's like a simplistic way to think of it.
Yeah, fantastic. Academics are often shat on as just being vessels that transport a brain around. Their bodies are just these little cars that just move their brains because their brains are so big and heavy and full of wonderful things. What do you think, Rob, academia does well when it comes to teaching?
Well, one thing it does very well is organization. Okay, so there's no fucking around with it, right? Like you've got to be organized about what you're doing. Professors understand this. They develop syllabi, right? Things like that. There's many things you can criticize academia for, but this is one thing I think that you can't. Jiu-jitsu is oftentimes not very organized, right? Imagine you came into a philosophy class and the professor was like, it's funny, I've actually had a class like this, but it's rare. So one time I went into a class and the professor was like, there's no syllabus and we're just going to do on that day whatever I feel like. I actually wound up dropping out of the class because I was like, I'm not taking this. This is not being taught very well. So, but for the most part, you come in, the professor has a syllabus, right? And you stick to the syllabus, right? And what's good about that is, ahead of time, the professor had to deliberately sit down and consider to themselves, what am I going to teach? What's the order I'm going to teach it? What's like the structure and such, right? Now, obviously, that's pretty rigid. So having a degree of flexibility is never bad, but having that basic structure will help guide you along and give you like some organization, right? Whereas a lot of jiu-jitsu coaches, they don't do that. They're just kind of like, they're doing what the other guy's doing. They just show up that day and they're like, all right, guys, whatever the fuck. You just think of something, you just show it, right? So having that basic organizational structure and a lot of coaches do that, of course, right? But that's something very positive that is fairly common in academia.
Yeah, organization. I think that's critical, Rob, when it comes to something like jiu-jitsu. You're a better witness than I am, but Danaher seems to have taken the kind of metas of academia and higher education and transferred them into the realm of learning, teaching and coaching jiu-jitsu. Do you think is that a fair statement? Has he kind of blended a hybrid of academia but brought it to the mats?
I think so, yeah. So it's funny. I was thinking about that the other day. I don't know. Have you ever heard of Mastering Jiu-Jitsu, the book?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
was that the one he did the history? Was that the one that he did with Henzo?
Yes. Yeah, book is awesome. I have it right over there, and it's one of my favorite jiu-jitsu books. And it's like, it's so funny when I read it because it's like, I've read a lot of academic papers, and you read academic papers, and there's a certain way that people write. There's sort of like a common sort of style. It's a little dry, but
yeah, very often.
Yeah, but at least one thing is it's very clear. As long as you understand the terms, it's very clear.
Right.
People look at academic writing and they think this is purposely obtuse. It's not. It's trying to be as precise and clear as possible. That's why, there's like a lot of technical terms. And Mastering Jiu-Jitsu, very much, it reads like that. So it's funny, like, I think what separates Danaher from a lot of other coaches, and this is obviously something that I've tried to emulate as well, is that he takes academic rigor and applies that to jiu-jitsu. The trouble is, I think a lot of people try to do that, but it's hard to do it without having you don't need to have an academic background, but I think it definitely helps because you kind of learn like, so for instance, like, you learn like, what does it mean to do research? And that sounds really obvious, but like there's a difference between doing research and just like looking at stuff, right? You know what I mean? So, and it's a bit tricky. Now, it's not complicated. I can explain it to somebody in like a minute, but unless you've been taught it, it's hard to do. And honestly, it's not taught in high school, and you really only learn it if you kind of go on to like higher um, uh, like levels of education, and then you're taught like research standards and stuff like that. You may actually you may never learn it if you have bad professors, but I had some good ones. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a certain there's methodology there that's not necessarily intuitive, and there's a lot of pitfalls, I think, in
Mhm.
there with confirmation bias and stuff like that, which is really common when people think they're doing research. They think they're finding answers that are somewhat objective, and actually they've had the wrong goggles on from the get-go. I don't think it's actually
Yeah.
an intuitive skill. Deductive reasoning kind of comes to mind, critical thinking, that kind of stuff. You kind of have to employ those faculties, I think, for research. So, from
Mhm.
my perspective, as a naive, youthful purple belt, it seems like what's going on with you Death Squad folks is there's a decision making process happening when you're competing, which is far above the competition. The way that you're deciding on what to do seems to be at least 2 steps ahead at all times. Not everybody, but let's say 8 out of 10 opponents. Is that an illusion, or is that it because jiu-jitsu has been taught to you in this specific fashion from Danaher's Charles Xavier brain?
Yeah. So, Charles Xavier. If we're the X-Men, I hope that I'm Nightcrawler. Anyway, so um, okay. Anyway, so um, yeah, I think that, I mean, it's pretty accurate. I think, I mean, it's funny. So you use the term decision making, right? So when people think of systems, they often think of algorithms or like you never see like a decision tree, right? It's like if this, then this, if this, then this, right? Blah blah, etc. Right? You have like a lot of you have a single starting point, or you maybe have multiple starting points actually. Then you have different possibilities, and it branches out, right? Based on what happens in the match. Okay, so like that is basically what Danaher has attempted to do with his systems. Now, that being said, when you're in the match itself, most of the time you're not thinking about that because you can't be because, like, you know what I mean. Imagine if you're like, imagine if you're sitting there, the guy's about to pull out of a maybe you have a single leg takedown. He's about to pull his leg out or sprawl on you, and you're like, what should I do? Option A is this, option B is this, right? Like next thing you know, you're face planting on the mat, right? So these are things that you have to do it ahead of time, right? A big part of jujitsu is fundamentally still a sport. It's an interesting thing because like so on one side of the spectrum you have people who they overthink it, right? People who they want it. I feel like I've actually been very guilty of this at times where I overthink stuff so much, and then the simple answer was there the whole time, right? I should have just been doing that, right? And but then there's other people who underthink it. They don't think about it enough. You know what I mean? So each of these are a problem, right? The people who overthink it, they maybe are doing, in fact, a very good job of sort of thinking about systems, but maybe they're thinking about it too much. It's actually a funny thing because you can do that. If you think too algorithmically, so think about a situation with a lot of uncontrolled variables. In a situation like that, the problem is you can't always have a rigid system because if you do, you're not going to be able to adapt and you're going to lose, right? It's just there's just too many things going on. You can't process it all. You've got to just it's easier in those situations to look for just simple guidelines, right? Or
Yeah,
heuristics, right?
yeah,
If you have that, it's easier to operate. You can just think, okay, I'm just giving you an example. I'm looking for an underhook from my butterfly guard, right? Etc. Even though you can work with an overhook too, but whatever, you know. And then the higher degree of control you attempt, or rather you succeed in gaining, right? Then the number of uncontrolled variables reduces, and then you can start thinking more algorithmically, right? So, for instance, I think the classic example, I think Danaher's, in my opinion, his shining achievement of systemic thinking is the back control. Okay, like he took the back control and he systemized it in a way that no one had ever done before. Obviously he was influenced by other people, right? So if you watch, like, for instance, old BJ Penn fights, definitely doing hand trapping stuff, but Danaher has organized it in a way that no one has ever done before. If you watch what Penn's doing, it's good, but it's definitely different. There's different hand fighting strategies going on. But anyway, so and the proof is that everybody now copies Danaher's approach to it. Literally everybody. You know, it's interesting because nobody argues that anymore. That is one of the, I think it's one of the only things in jiu-jitsu that we all have come together and agreed, yeah, okay, the straitjacket system is the best thing to do. Like,
legit, yeah.
Yeah, everybody agrees on that, right? And you know it because you can just watch and see what they're doing, right? Nobody argues it anymore. And it's because there's so much control in the back, right? The back control position, right? It's a situation where the guy has like 4 options, you know what I mean? And you can have an answer for all those options, you know? So like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I watched your back control video you put up the other day, actually, the 40-minute one. Really good.
Nice.
Really, really
Thank
cool.
you.
That was an amazing, you're really good at compressing ideas, man. If you can do Wittgenstein in 2 minutes, then you can definitely do back control from like a 16-hour DVD into a 40-minute video. Yeah, really cool. And I'll put that in the show notes for people to watch if they haven't seen it already. It's really interesting. There's a thing you talk about on that video, a word that really struck out to me was configurations. Variations is like another term I use in my own mind, but configurations, and you said it in the context of there's many ways you can configure your legs around your opponent when you're on their back. And I thought that's a really interesting word to use, because once you understand that the umbrella term is back control, and then there's many configurations of back control, you're halfway there to understanding all the variables and nuances of something as vast as back control. You kind of boiled down a categorization into different configurations.
Right.
I think when it comes to explaining something like back control, do you think then you have to start with nomenclature? You have to start with nameable, describable kind of positions, because you think all the configurations that can happen in back control, like where the fuck do you even start? So do you have to start back at the labels and the kind of nomenclature first? Is that the way that it's best to understand it?
It's just easier, I think. It's just
Yeah.
way easier. So ultimately, a lot of what we're doing with language is trying to help our stupid brains because, like, you know what I mean? Like, at the end of the day, the human brain can only process so much, right? So you're trying to make it easier for yourself when you're using terms, you know, like so like imagine if every time I was explaining something to a student, I was like, okay, now we're going to do the back control position where your legs are crossed around one of their legs. No, not that leg, the other leg. Now cross your ankles. Yeah, like, you know, it's like, you lose track of what you're doing very fast, right? So like, and then honestly, you forget stuff doing that, right? That's actually, I think one of the biggest problems in learning jujitsu is loss of information. You forget stuff, you know what I mean? Because like if you don't write it down, if you don't record it, it's like it can be very easy to forget it, and it's so frustrating when that happens, you know. And it's like, so I'm very diligent about like recording everything I do and writing stuff down and trying to be organized about that. But anyway, to get back to back control, yeah, it's just easier. So you have like names for different. So it's interesting that you pinpointed the term configuration because I was thinking the other day. So you've got like this question. It's a question that doesn't really matter that much, but it's kind of interesting to me. When does a position end and a configuration begin? Right. So, or rather, maybe the other way is the better way to say it. When does a configuration end and a new position begin? Right. So, for instance, is the cross body ride a new position, or is it just a configuration of your legs, a variation of back control? Right. Ultimately, the question doesn't really matter that much. You can debate about it, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that it's like you have many different ways to configure your body around someone else's. And the goal is we want to have as clear and precise a set of terminology as possible. You know, you want to leave as little to ambiguity as possible. The more ambiguity there is, the harder it is to clearly convey what you're doing, right? As a coach, I think 2 things are very key. Obviously, many things are key, but at least on this topic. First of all, you've got to have shared language with your students. At this point, Danaher's talked about that until he's blue in the face. I feel like people should agree on that by this point. Okay. Something else that's less spoken about is you've got to be insistent upon the language, right? And so you've got to basically you have to be something of a dictator with it, right? Like sometimes you'll have students that will like, I've had this. They're like, I don't want to use that term. And I'm like, too bad. That's what we're using. Like, this is not a democracy, like, so obviously as a coach, right, you want to be open-minded, but something you don't need to be open-minded about are names. Now, the reality is I've actually changed names. If a student has a name for something and I actually think it's an easier to remember name, or maybe it better describes what we're doing, right? Like I'm not opposed to that, but then that's my decision as the coach. I'm taking that and I'm adopting that. You have to have consistency with your team, and you've got to insist upon it, and you can't be changing it too much. The more if you change it, like imagine if you had a position and every 3 months you change the name of it. What's going
Yeah.
on? And people do that sometimes, right? Like there are some positions that I have seen, like the cross ashu position. I'm not changing the name anymore. Guys, we've changed the name of this position 8 times. Like the name has changed too many times. First it was inside Senkaku, then it became the saddle. Then some people started calling it honey hole. Before it was inside Senkaku, it was 411. Guys, enough. Cross ashi is fine. Like, or saddle. To me, saddle and cross ashi, those are the 2 acceptable names at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, otherwise it just goes crazy. I think you said it before, and I agree that Eddie Bravo did one thing really well, and that was coming up with memorable names for positions that maybe people hadn't seen before. And if
Right,
nothing
yes.
else, it helps you as a point of reference to picking up names.
Right.
One thing we've been playing around with my sort of training partner bubble is labeling nuanced configurations, for example, in leg lock positions, by the people that we've seen use it the most in competition. So we use the Craig Jones cross ashi, we use the Lachlan Giles cross ashi, and we use the Eddie Cummings cross ashi, slight configuration tweaks, just to kind of just to help categorize it really in the brain. Whether or not they were the original proprietors of that technique or not is irrelevant. It's just a kind of it's a language referencing tool. I don't know whether we'll keep doing that or not, but it's been quite funny to say, do the Craig Jones or whatever, and see what happens. But on the flip side of that, and I really noticed this when I was training some of your ideas that I saw on your YouTube channel, my training partners who are more vague in the nomenclature and the lexicon of what we were doing took longer to learn. The ones that really dialed in on the names of the positions meant that when they had a question arise, they could refer to the names of the positions in their question and get a more direct answer. Whereas the other ones who didn't have the basic grasp on the terminology, I could see them trying to literally come up with their own naming in their head. And as a result, they didn't ask the right questions, and then they don't get the right answers, and then they don't learn as quick. I've seen that in action with my training partners. Very interesting. The clearer you are on your terms, I think, and maybe we agree here, the faster you can learn something like jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, undeniably. No, that makes complete sense. The only exception to this is you do get people sometimes who are like very natural, intuitive, kinesthetic learners, right? That they're like, I don't know what this is called. I just do it, right? Like you do get people like that. But in my opinion, those people are outliers. I think as a coach, your goal has to be to develop a teaching methodology that works for. So, for instance, imagine a learner like that. The trick is he's not going to be harmed by having a clear set of terminology. It harms no one and it helps everyone. Maybe it's not essential for. Maybe you get 1 out of every 200 students who's a kinesthetic learner that doesn't need that, right? Those people are extreme outliers. It's probably more than 1 out of 200, right? Like, so somebody like Marcelo was probably like a kinesthetic learner, right? Where he just figured stuff out through kinesthetic awareness, right? I've actually read a lot of Josh Waitskin, who's one of his black belt students, who's written about how Marcelo's very kinesthetic. His kinesthetic learning is very like very, very fast, and he just picks stuff up, and he doesn't even know how to describe it sometimes, but he just gets it, right? And so for those people, it's like, look, by all means, you know what I mean? Like that, if that works for you, don't stop doing it. But as a coach, you can't count on that. You can't be sitting there thinking like, well, I hope all my students are rare outliers.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
You know,
I'm really glad you brought up that point actually on learning, I guess, learning styles. I don't know whether they've been debunked or not in science, but I just think it's a really useful idea to hold in your head from a teaching and coaching perspective, that there are going to be people in your class, jiu-jitsu, for example, that are going to learn in different ways. And we might all utilize crossovers of these different methods of learning, but ultimately we will have a favorite kind of way. When I teach, I see distinct people who are kinesthetic learners. I see people who are visual learners. I see people who just need to hear the rhythm of the drill for themselves to sort of learn. They learn by listening, or they may be more audible. I see it. I see all variations. Now, my lifelong question so far has been, and I'm going to ask you this because I think you can answer it, and I think you might have already answered it, is if retention is the most important thing when it comes to jiu-jitsu and teaching it, whether you want people to retain information so that they can use it. How do you ensure that everybody in the room, regardless of learning styles, has the highest degree of retention?
yeah, I mean, it's very hard to answer, but what I would do is I would try to you you've got to think long term. Okay, it's ultimately so. I've talked to some of my students here about this actually because they've been curious about it. You can't. I think it's a misconception that the sole job of a coach is in conveying information. You are doing that, of course, right? That's a big part of what you're doing, but it's not the entire thing. I would argue possibly an even bigger part is you are designing a training environment, right? So the culture of the environment, the vibe, if you will. Right now, imagine the difference between in the blue basement. I just made a post yesterday where I said it was just me drilling in the blue basement. I said, very brief. I just said, basically, this was taken during the golden age of the blue basement. I'm glad I got to be there for it. That was, man, that was a place that was like magical. It sounds very sort of esoteric, but like when I say magical, I just mean it was very special. It was like, man, you'd have like 60 to 80 people on the mat. And it was an environment that like, it was this, I constantly felt like I was among other people who had similar goals to me. Like look, people that do what I did are not, there's not a lot of us, and maybe for good reason. Like I, dropped out of school and started pursuing jiu-jitsu full time. And I had, among me, I had, one of my main training partners was he was a retired military guy. Very young. He was in his 20s. He just got out of the military young, and he was using the money he got from that to train jiu-jitsu full time. I had a guy who was a part-time programmer. He was like, could have been full time and made a ton of money, but he went part time, so he just made enough to live and trained full time. A guy who he was actually a landlord, but he didn't make as much. He kept his work pretty low, so he could train full time. Right, like all these people that are jiu-jitsu was our life, was our focus, and so as a result, you get this room where and it's all structured by Danaher, right? He's giving us a training methodology, and I would talk to him a lot about this. He was very open to me about like the ideas, the strategies, what he was doing, right? And it's that was like a laboratory. It felt like being among like if you the top universities in the world in certain topics. I was like, that's what it felt like for jiu-jitsu, right? And not even just that, it was like kind of like an open laboratory, right? Like one time Danaher said to me, you can think of what we're doing here as each of you are like graduate students pursuing your PhDs in jiu-jitsu in a sense, right? That's kind of like what a black belt is, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you're like, and so to me, that kind of an environment. So for instance, I'll give you examples. The kind of an environment where you have people who are moving towards common goals cooperatively, right? The kind of environment where people are unafraid to ask questions, the kind of environment where people are focused on deliberate improvement, right? Imagine an environment where everybody just goes to war every day. Well, you can get better there, but I don't think it's as productive long term as what I just described, right? Like if every day you're just battling it out with your teammates, it's not that helpful. Like I'll give you a very concrete example. I am very unafraid to allow, back in the blue basement, I would be very unafraid to allow people to catch me in submissions as long as I knew them, right? Why is that? Because I trust them. You know, they're trying to. We're working towards a common goal. It's not like they're not going to destroy my leg. Now, if I never allow people to get that deep on me, the trouble is you never get the opportunity to practice getting out of those situations. Of course, you're going to get tapped. Like Gary Tonin was famous for this. Have you? Did you ever get a chance to go to Henzo's?
Not yet. No, maybe one day in the future if the world ever goes back to normal, mate. But
Okay,
it's one of my bucket list kind of rash guard t-shirt purchase places of all time. Yeah.
right. Okay. Well, anyway, so you can ask most people that, and I'll ask almost anyone that's gone there, how does Gary Tonin tap? And he taps very loudly and like, because he lets himself get put into bad spots all the time, all day. He's doing that constantly. That's why he's so good at escapes. And then it's like almost like a meme, like he's tapping, like tap, 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 because
Wow.
he's like, I'm letting you get super deep on me. Yeah, I want to
Yeah.
make sure I get out before I get injured.
Yeah. I've heard
Yeah,
him talk about
uh,
like if you're not, he would tap anywhere from sort of, I don't know, up to at least 3 times around because he's like, if you're not doing that, you're not learning. Like you're not putting yourself in those positions. But I like that you framed that scenario with people you know. I think that's
right.
important because we've all trained with the crazy guest, player that comes in and is there to destroy people's knees or whatever. And you're
Yeah.
like, oh my God, don't roll with this guy. Like he's just,
Yes.
like no one knows him. So I think the knowing your partners is important. But yeah, allowing yourself to get put in the bad position so that you can come up with the answers. That's massive. And you can't really do that. You're right. If you're butting heads at 100% all the time. Now I know in the combat sports world, I term this as the old school methodology of last man standing. Basically, if you put 300 guys in a room and say, right, 100%, we're going to do 6 rounds. The one who stood up at the end of it, like, barely breathing or whatever, you'd be like, yeah, put him in for the UFC. He's obviously the best, but you just
Right.
counted out the other 299 potential champions that you could have like bred, for example. Whereas if you're in there and you're all kind of, like you say, cooperative exploration and research, you might produce 300 champions.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
interesting.
No, I totally agree. Yeah. Well, I want to add also, and this is I think a part of your job as a coach is making sure. Imagine if you have one of your students and they start getting. So I'll give you a specific story that involved me one time. So one time I'm not going to say who the training partner was. Me and a training partner were getting very into it, and I got a heel hook on them, and I went really hard for it. And Danaher pulled me aside and he was like, "Rob," he said, "Come on, you can't do that." Because I know it was getting heated. He collar tied you pretty hard, and he's like, "Don't do that. Please don't do that." And that was that was the only time he ever had to say that to me. Because I mean, I'm mostly a very calm guy, but basically the guy he collar tied me really hard back then. I was like, "You fuck." Like, yeah. So like, obviously it's a combat sport. Things can get heated sometimes, but to my credit, in like 5, 6 years of being there, that was the only time I did that. So it's
Yeah, just needed
uh,
that one stern talking to, and you learnt your
yeah,
lesson.
yeah.
That's good. That's good. That produces a proper environment.
Mhm.
Rob, I wanted to pick your brains then a bit more on the teaching side of things. Your approach to teaching beginners. Do you adhere to this idea that movements should be taught before moves? Um, and once the movements have been taught, let's say, what moves do you begin with? Now, I heard that you're a massive fan of starting from closed guard and teaching arm bars. Is that right?
No. Yeah. No, that's like the opposite of I actually think it's interesting. Two different coaches, Krishna Mirja from Long Island and Rob Biernacki from Canada. I haven't done this in my classes yet, but I definitely have thought about it. They actually ban closed guard for white belts because the idea is that you want them to play as much open guard as possible. I haven't done it yet because I haven't seen it be too much of a problem because I don't ban it, but I like discourage it. Like I tell people,
Sure.
like you should be, you know what I mean. So I haven't felt the need to go so far as to ban it, but I do think it's a very interesting idea. And these two guys came up with it independently. I think it's interesting. Whenever you see intelligent people coming up with shared problems to common solutions, or you know what I mean, like independently,
Yeah.
I think it's a good sign. But
Yeah, you're
anyway,
getting an objectivity from that, aren't you? If you're two opposite ends of the earth are coming up with the same answer, there might be some truth in it.
yes, definitely. So anyway, so okay, so on this idea of like teaching beginners and fundamentals, man, I actually think it's a super, super interesting topic, which is what are the fundamentals? I actually
Right.
think there are, I don't think there's a single set of things that we could call the fundamentals. I really don't. Because I think basically all it comes down to is, look, you've got to ask yourself first, what are you trying to teach your students? Okay. Jiu-jitsu is very broad. Now, what you're trying to teach your students, I think, ought to be based on the goals of your students, right? Let's confine ourselves exclusively to competitive students. You can do this for non-competitive students, but it's a little easier because we have like a lens through which to filter our goals, which are tournaments, right? So let's say you have a student and his goal is to win EBI. It doesn't exist anymore, but EBI tournaments, right? Like the Emerald City Invitational just happened, awesome EBI tournament, so maybe the format's back. Anyway, then you also got ADCC. These are very different rule sets. Now, if your student's sole goal is to win ADCC, or his sole goal is to be the best EBI grappler in the world, I don't think you should start them off in the same way. I think that you ought to start them off. Obviously, there are going to be things that everyone shares. That's a given. So, for instance, right now with my students here in Singapore, I have two different groups based on what I want them to work on right now. Group A is working on one thing, Group B is working on two things, and then they're both working on two other things. So Group A has three things, but the topic they have is a little bit bigger. And Group B has two things, and then they have the two. Everyone has those two central things, right? So and now eventually we're going to get to another unit, and it's going to be a follow-up from what we did in the first unit, right? So the idea is that, okay, we all have shared things, right? We have topics that we do when we do technique. Then we have free drilling. I let them drill whatever they want. And then we do positional rounds, and then we go live. The purpose of the positional rounds is to basically to force them to work on the things that they're working on. So for instance, the first two positional rounds it's based on the first two things that we're all working as a team. Now the third positional round it's varied based on, are you in Group A or are you in Group B? Now sometimes you'll get a Group A guy rolling with a Group B guy. In that case, what I've told them is, of the two of them, who's ever the senior student, they get priority, right? So the senior student, they're going to work on what they're going to work on. Or alternatively, if the guy in Group A wants to work on what's in Group B, he's free to do it. He can if he wants. I want them to mostly focus on what they're doing, but obviously you're training every day, multiple times a day. It's okay to mix it up, right? So, And so I'm doing this. I have these units based on their goals and based on also their personality and body types, right? So Group A, those guys there's a certain set of things I'm having them work on based on their body types and personality, right? That's why I've grouped them together. And Group B, similar things, right? So what we're moving towards are common goals. Basically, the big goal we have is Asian trials just in December here in Singapore. So that's what we're working towards. And so now on the other hand, you've also always got to be thinking, I think, about skill on a general level, and maybe that's what we can call fundamentals. But I still think it has to always be like look, I'll give you an example. Let's imagine you spent 10 years working on things that people call fundamental, but to be honest, do not work at a high level. Is that worth your time? I don't really think it is. Now imagine I spent 2 years working only on those things that have been proven historically to work consistently at a high level. Which of those is a better use of your time? I think the guy who spent 2 years is going to be a better grappler in 2 years than the guy who spent 10 years working on bullshit. There's a Ryan Hall article from Lock Flow. It's a very old article from like 2009. And it's an interview. I really love it. I read it for the first time the other day. Somebody linked it on Reddit. And Ryan Hall's talking about his old approach to playing guard, which is obviously, if you know from back in the day, Ryan Hall used to invert and go for triangles a lot, right? And Ryan Hall has subsequently become very critical of that style of guard playing because he had some matches where he got smashed. There's a match, not a lot of people have seen it, against Cobrinha, where Cobrinha fucked him up. You know what I mean? Like fucked him up bad. He stacked him, took his back, strangled him. And Ryan had a couple matches like that. Ryan had matches against guys that, to be honest, Ryan is better than. There's a match against Shane Roller back in the day. Shane Roller was a tough MMA fighter. But man, I'm sorry. An MMA fighter should not be beating Ryan fucking Hall. And what happened is Shane Roller stacked him and took his back. So Ryan started to see flaws with his approach, and he outlines what he thinks is a higher level strategy, which is ultimately what he outlines is basically take the guy down, pass his guard, take his back. Which is funny. I honestly think that meta is the most consistent meta in points formats. That sort of like old school, strategy of putting the man down to his hips, passing his guard, and taking his back. Now, I think in the modern day, I think that leg locks and all these things, they fuse together in a way that it's not incompatible with that, right? I don't think it is at all. In fact, I think leg locks it can be a very powerful feature of that strategy of putting the guy down to his hips, passing his guard, taking his back. Because think of this, Gordon has done this very successfully many times. Is it harder to retain your guard if you're thinking about a threat coming this way but not towards your legs? Or is it harder to think about a threat going in both directions, right? It's much harder, right? You're trying to think about, I don't want to get leg locked, but I also don't want to get passed. So it adds another dimension to that. But anyway, I'm getting slightly off topic.
No, it makes complete sense. You've talked, Rob, before about kind of deliberate improvement, your idea of deliberate improvement. Now, obviously, your students are under the faithful and trusted hands of you to direct their curriculum, which is fantastic. But I'm interested in, how do you encourage your students, Rob, to get better outside of the class scenario or environment?
Well, it's an interesting thing because I've thought a lot about this, and ultimately, it's something that it's pretty hard to do because at the end of the day, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? You can't make people do things they don't want to do. At least that you could do that in the training room, but maybe not outside it, right? So it's like I don't worry too much about it because I can't control that, But I think the best students, I'll encourage it, right? Like I think that's important, encouraging it. But the best students, the ones that really rise above, are the ones that a student is always going to be influenced by his coach, but he can't just be influenced by his coach. He's also got to be doing a lot of his own work as well. You know what I mean? Like Danaher helped me and influenced me, but like I'm also doing like a ton of work on my own. You know what I mean? Like if I was, I wouldn't be very good. And that goes for literally every student in the world. Like imagine, like I have out here in Singapore, a set of central students that I'm working with, anywhere from like 8 to 10 on a given day. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think I have time in my day to be like super focused on what every single one of those guys is doing at any given moment? That's why I put them in groups. I feel like it's easier structure to work with, right? Like, no, I don't. And also, to be honest, I don't want to. Like, I have my own competitive career. On top of that, I have my own fucking life. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be like every single guy. Like, and like, I will focus. Like, if there's certain people who I think the more focus I see in you, the more I'm going to focus on you, right? The more you show up and you work hard and you are serious about your training, the more you do that, the more I'm going to put back into you. I think I am an unbelievably generous coach. I think I'm a much more generous coach than most coaches are, right? Because I genuinely really love jiu-jitsu and I want to help my students get better. Like as soon as we're done with this podcast, I'm going to drill with one of my students here. Like him and I are going to drill for like 2 hours. And obviously that's good for me too. But like he's basically getting a free. He's not paying me for it. He's getting like a free private at it.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
No, that's really, really cool. Going back to a couple of things you said in your class structure, you said a lot about position specific sparring. Now, Askren, when he was on Rogan, I think a couple of years ago, was shitting on jiu-jitsu. And he said, wrestlers have got this right and jiu-jitsu's got this wrong. And in wrestling, we do position-specific sparring for 90% of our sparring curriculum. And we only really do free sparring for kind of, coming up to competitions or whatever he said it was. And he said, jiu-jitsu's got that wrong. And I think that was a little harsh because there are jiu-jitsu schools, like yours that really, put emphasis on position specific, but you seem to have incorporated autonomy into it too, where you're kind of saying the senior student might get priority in choosing what it is they want to work on, or you're letting the student almost guide themselves under your guidance.
Yeah.
Is that something that you came up with, or something you've seen work elsewhere, like in the Blue Basement that you're referencing, or a bit of both?
No, Danaher never did that, but I'm doing that because like I have at the end of the day, what's going to be good for person A might not be good for person B. So I want to have a little bit of variance possible in the training structure, right? Like, let's say you have a student who, like, in my group B, they're focused on guard retention. My group A is focused on wrestling. You know what I mean? Like, if I have a group, and there's reasons for this, right? If I have a group A guy focusing on group B, what they're doing, it's like, I don't think it's a super productive use of his. Obviously, those topics are still, at the end of the day, I want everyone to be good at both of those topics, right? But the reality is, some grapplers are going to be more geared towards this style, and some are going to be more geared towards this style, right? So, I you know, obviously, I have a fair bit of experience, and I can sort of see where things are going with certain grapplers. Like, okay, that guy is definitely not going to be a D1 wrestler, but he's very flexible guard. Let's pursue that. Let's make sure his guard is very hard to pass. Okay, that guy, definitely more athletic, a bit bassier, wants to be on top. Okay, let's focus on wrestling for him, right? For instance. Yeah, I mean, so I've seen that Askren interview, and what's interesting is I totally agree with him. I think he's basically totally right. He is big, harsh, but I really don't think he's that wrong. What's funny is even a lot of jiu-jitsu schools that do positional rounds, I think they do them wrong. So there's two ways positional rounds can go wrong. So the first one is unclear win conditions. You just like put them in a position, you say go, and then they just like they fall out of the position and they didn't work what they're supposed to work on, right? Like, imagine you have a wrestling round and somebody keeps pulling guard or something, right? Like, I've seen this in schools before. It's like, guys, that's not the point of the round. You know what I mean? Like, you got to establish clear win conditions, and you've got to give rules. You got to say, no, you can't do that in this round, right? And the rules have to make sense, of course, right? Okay, the second thing is you've got to have a long-term plan for your positional rounds. I can't tell you this. To me, this is the biggest mistake. I see this so much, where a school will do positional rounds, but it'll be a new positional round every day. What the fuck is the point of that? You're not building anything over a long period of time. The point of a positional round is to force skill development in a specific area. Now, imagine if every day I came to a classroom and they began a new lesson of a new language. Today we're learning Greek. Today we're learning Hungarian. Today we're learning Polish, right? Yeah. It's like, what are we doing? Imagine if you just spent 6 months on Greek. You would have learned, now you wouldn't be fluent, but you'd be better at Greek, right? So it's a similar thing. Like, if every day you're cycling the positions constantly, so these positions that I'm having my students run through, the first two will never change, ever. Those are going to be constant throughout their whole careers. Throughout my time at the Blue Basement, we always did 3 to 4 positional rounds. So we would do usually 6 to 8 rounds in a given class, and we'd always do 3 to 4 positional rounds, always. And 2 of them never changed. So we had different ones coming in and out. So for instance, we would do like ashigarami sometimes. Sometimes we did jujigatami, the arm bar position, right? But what would never change is we always did mount. So you'd start in bottom mount and then turtle position. Those never changed. Those are the 2 static ones. Now, I'm not doing mount because I always hated that round. But I am doing turtle. I think turtle is inarguably important. So that one for me, that will never, ever, ever change. That will always be the first round of my classes. In Danaher's classes, it was the second. He would always start us with mount, which I thought was so brutal. It's awful. Yeah. But that's how he did things. But because now over time, it's a funny thing because you're forced to get better at it. You don't have a choice in the matter, right? If every day you're going to be in turtle position at the start of class, you're going to figure out how to play turtle. You know what I mean? For sure. It's going to be hammered into you. Yeah,
absolutely. It's about the repetition and consistency in that position over time. What's your time frame? Well, I suppose you said it there. Actually, two will never change. When you're cycling stuff in, how long will you run something before you cycle something else in? Do you do it on a monthly cycle, or is that a weekly thing, or is it just kind of once they've got the hang of it?
So right now I'm working with a pretty small group of guys, so it's easier to keep track of. I can watch them and I can say, like, okay, they've got this. We can move on now, right? Like, so I don't have to be too rigid with it. But
Yeah,
when I'm working with a larger group, I'd probably go like monthly, and then it depends on what the goals are, right? So for instance, we have ADCC trials in 8 months here. Okay, so right now I'm kind of thinking like 2 month units, right? I won't be too rigid with that because again, it's a small group, so I can tailor it. It's not too hard to change things, right? Like, but yeah, I'm thinking usually two months right now. But again, it's that I think is the more fluid aspect of that. So early on when I was coaching, I was super rigid. I think it's important to be organized, but there's a level of rigidity you can get to that's too much, right? So
yeah.
Danaher, yeah, it can overwhelm things, and it becomes like stuck, and you got to have a level of flexibility. So Danaher, um, again, anyone that's ever trained the blue base will know this. There is no set time to the rounds, which is like very odd to most jiu-jitsu guys. Yeah, so Danaher doesn't time the rounds. He just sort of watches them, and he has sort of an internal clock.
I
And
bet
then
he
when it,
fucking does.
yeah, yeah, he's so I've spoken to him about this. He's watching, so he'll take a round, he'll watch someone, he'll make sure they're doing what he wants them to do. Time will tick, time will tick, time will tick. Maybe he switches to somebody else. You know what I mean? Like, and then could go on 10, 15, it could go on 15 minutes. I think probably goes on about like 6 to 8 around, but that's why like we only do 6 to 8 rounds because the round could go 15 minutes. You know what I mean? And as a student, you have no fucking idea. You have no idea. And what's funny is sometimes, this is just like a funny anecdote. Sometimes you'll realize, oh, I'm the person he's watching, and he's
You're holding everyone up.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's like, like, oh, he's waiting for me to get this. Like I had a round where I had somebody's back and it was going on forever. I was like, oh my God, what is going on here? Then I realized I see him staring at me. I'm like, oh, I gotta either submit him or he's gonna get out. And like, yeah, eventually I got the strangle, and then as soon as I did the round ended, I was like, oh, whew, thank God.
Yeah,
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah, you don't want to be the fall guy for the entire basement. That's for sure.
right.
We touched, Rob, a little earlier on the kinesthetic learning and how kinesthetic learners can be outliers and great athletes. I cross paths with them more often than you'd think. But coaching when you're an outlier, kinesthetic stud athlete is not always their forte. I had many coaches growing up who would explain to me in the best, bless them, in the best way possible, just do it. I'm like, oh man, like
Right.
I know you can do it. You've done it to a world championship level, but telling me to just do it doesn't help me in the slightest. Do you think, Rob, that the skill of jujitsu, or the skill of teaching jujitsu, can be taught, or just some people are made and cut out to do it, and some people are always going to be less good at it?
Well, it's a bit of both. So I do think it can be taught, but I think there's a degree to which not everyone per se can learn it, right? So um, you can teach it, I think, to anyone. But like the thing is like in my opinion, anyone can learn almost anything. The degree to which someone is going to be capable of getting better at though is going to be based on their willingness to focus on it. And ultimately, I can't make a student focus on something. You know what I mean? Like that's you know what I mean? Even if you're like the positional rounds are designed to force skill development, but I'll be honest, you could go through like 10 months of working a single position and just not really trying very hard or focusing on it, and you really don't get better at it. It's definitely possible. It's unlikely, but it's definitely possible. So if you have, so you will come across students where you just don't get through to them, and like you try to teach them, but they're just not. They don't care. They don't want to hear what you're saying, and so they never get anywhere, right? So I do think anyone in the world hypothetically can be taught how to coach well. It's going to simply come down to a matter of are they willing to focus on it and hear you out? You know what I mean? Yeah, that's really it.
Yeah, coaching's a skill, just like jujitsu is a skill, and yeah, if you're a keen learner and you want to do it, you're more likely to do it, aren't you? It's very
Yes.
very interesting. Teaching to me, I've had a whole host of shit teachers of all sorts of things. Mostly my school career growing up, I thought was an absolute farce. There was only one or two teachers that I really resonated with in their teaching kind of methodology, and funnily enough, they were the ones that really wanted to be there. Everybody else was just there for salary-based benefits, and I picked up on that, and you can just tell that they weren't really into it. I think I agree. I think you can teach anybody to teach, but there's always going to be people that are just going to be better at it. And very often, the people that are best at it are not always the world class doers of it. Actually, they can do it to a competent level, but they're more aware of how to develop people further down the line to be better than them. I guess the whole goal of coaching is to make your players and athletes better than you could ever be. That's kind of the point. Like, otherwise you're holding everyone back if you want them to be, less good than you. So it's the opposite. You want to make them bigger and better than you could be. But if you were a world champion, that doesn't necessarily mean you know how to breed world champions per se. It's a really interesting dichotomy. Rob, I wanted to pick your brains a little bit on strength and conditioning. Now, you're not a small chap. You've got a bit of muscle on you, and I noticed in watching some of your competition footage, you got some gains there. You're a strong lad, and I've seen you training as well. I've seen you shifting some tin around on the old barbells and stuff. My day job is a strength coach, so I'm biased. But what do you think doing S&C outside of mat time gives you in terms of sort of helping with your jiu-jitsu, or what does it do for you, like lifting and such?
Yeah. So, okay. So I want to preface this by saying, like, I'm not a strength coach. So it's just my anecdotal sort of opinion. What's interesting is actually down the line, I've been thinking about this. I'd like to become like, I think it's really good to be, a, have like a strength coaching background in addition to a jiu-jitsu background. So I do actually want to ultimately learn quite a lot more about strength training because I think it's so valuable for jiu-jitsu guys for two main reasons. The first one is that in terms of performance, I think the increase of static strength is one of the best things you can do. Now, again, I'm not a sports science expert, but I have experimented a lot throughout the years with different exercise methodologies, and I am of the opinion that it is very hard to develop explosiveness. It's very hard to develop speed. I'm very skeptical as to the degree to which it's possible to really consistently improve these things to a meaningful degree. You can, of course, improve them, but to a degree that actually confers significant benefits in the competition. Now, what you can very measurably increase over time is static strength. It's very easy to measurably increase that, right? Like, you can track as your progress goes up, right? So I'm a big believer in static strength training because I think you can measure the progress over time. And I think that helps a lot in jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu, a lot of it is about static strength. Your goal is, of course, to statically control somebody and limit their options, right? Like, you want to limit movement. That's the whole point of the sport, ultimately. And then the second thing, arguably the more important thing, is injury prevention. So I've had a fair share of injuries throughout my career, and I think that a big part of it, quite frankly, was I didn't take care of myself well. I sort of fell into that jujitsu person trap of being like, well, I'm just going to roll, I'll just roll, like, why do I need to do strength training, right? Like, I've had different periods where I focused very hard on it, and then I sort of got lazy. Like, when you're training like 6, 7, 8 hours a day jujitsu, sometimes it's hard to motivate yourself to lift. So I'm like, I would make excuses and not do it. And quite frankly, I don't think that's good in the long term. I think it's actually better to take a little bit less time to train and add the weight training in. I'm a big believer now in strength training. In the last maybe like 8 months, I got with a strength coach back in the US who basically taught me everything that I'm doing now, and I still communicate with him. We message on Instagram and such. And I also am very lucky to have a good friend of mine who's a strength coach as well. By the way, just to shout them out. But the strength coach I was working with in New York was Dr. Amato, and my friend's name is Jason Rosati. They're both strength coaches, very, very good at what they're doing and very helpful to me, right? So I can ask either of these guys questions and they give like great feedback. And so I've gotten super into strength training, like, and I've been making pretty good gains. My goal is not muscular strength. Muscular size. could
Yeah.
not give less of a shit. In fact, I don't want to get that big, because if I do, I'm going to go up a weight class. So I want to make sure I don't do that. But I'm very focused on posterior chain stuff, like squats, deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, hex bar deadlifts, kettlebell swings, Nordics, hamstring curls. I want to work the posterior chain as much as I can. And I'm very focused also on like grip strength. I think grip strength matters a ton in jiu-jitsu. And like pulling, so like the lats. I don't really like, I bench press, but I don't really care how big my chest is. So it's not like a focus.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, from my understanding, and the more I learn about strength, the more I realize I know fuck all, but it seems to boil down to absolute strength and relative strength. Absolute strength, how much weight can you lift once or 3 times or whatever for a given number of reps? And then relative, how can you control your own body against disadvantageous leverages, basically. You could have the powerlifting end of the absolute spectrum, and you could have the ring gymnast on the top end of the relative spectrum. And I think when it comes to strength training, you want a bit of both. You want some absolute training, which would be, you know, your squats, your deadlifts, shifting some timber around on the barbell. And then you also want some relative kind of strength where you're controlling your own body in a matrix of space. I'm interested that you did put lots of posterior chain work. Yeah, that's very interesting when it comes to athletic development. I don't know any athletic development program that doesn't include posterior chain work. It's an incredible kinetic chain through the body to kind of develop. What's your favorite? Are you a puller in the deadlifts, or do you prefer squatting, or do you like both?
I like both, but deadlifts are my favorite by far.
Yeah, that's your go-to. It'd be interesting. I mean, you can see your anatomy, I suppose, when it comes to competition footage in terms of like your femur ratio to your leg length and how like long your torso is. I think you've talked a lot about if you're not teaching jiu-jitsu based on somebody's physical attributes in terms of anatomy, you're doing them a disservice. And I would agree with that. I wonder then, mechanically you've probably got more advantage. I wonder anatomically when it comes to pulling than it does when it's squatting. People fall in one of the two categories. I'm a squatter. I got short ass legs. I got big ass quads. I'm naturally like quad dominant, and I love the back squats, my thing. And then you get other people a bit longer legged and they like the pulls. Injury prevention is really, really a big part of it. I would argue my job predominantly as a strength coach towards athletes is to get them to a place where they are healthy and injury proofed enough to practice their sport more so they can get better at their sport.
Right.
That's basically what I'm doing. I'm preparing them to be resilient enough to train hard and smart enough to get better at jiu-jitsu. I'm not teaching them to, or whatever their sport is, I'm not teaching them to lift per se to get bigger numbers, although that might come into it. They're measurable metrics, but that's not the end goal. The end goal is actually to be injury proof so they can go and do their sport more. So that's cool that you've picked up on the injury prevention side of things. Was there any like big kind of learning points when you realized what kind of stuff you needed to do in the gym to keep you injury proofed for the mats?
I mean, working with Dr. Amato, it was really the intense emphasis on posterior chain stuff, like for instance, specifically my hamstrings. So he basically pointed out to me in jiu-jitsu, I'm always elevating people with my quads from butterfly guard. And he basically, I had a very dramatic discrepancy in strength between quads and hamstrings. My hamstrings.
Did you really?
Yeah, they were very weak by comparison because I'm always lifting, guys. Yeah,
reps. Yeah.
Yes, my quads got pretty strong, but my hamstrings were like very weak by comparison. Now they're pretty balanced. I've worked very hard to balance them out. And just to add also, I really want to learn how to be like a true strength coach in time. It's a long-term goal, because I think ultimately, if my goal is to be a very good coach, helping my athletes to understand how to not get injured, I really think the value of it cannot be understated. Danaher said once, and I think he's very right, that the single greatest impediment to long-term progress are injuries. You get hurt, and how are you gonna get better, right? You can watch tape and stuff, but obviously nothing limits you more than an injury will, right? So I think that, so for instance, like I'm right now, when I lift, sometimes I'll have some of my students lift with me and I'm teaching them stuff. I'm no expert, but I'm showing them what I know right now. And in time, I really want to get better. My long-term goal is to have my own gym, and I really want to have obviously a mat area, but then I want to have a weightlifting area off to the side where I can do that stuff. You know what I mean? And so yeah, I mean, it's like so I think the mistake I always made was I looked at jujitsu purely as an intellectual thing, which is kind of dumb because it's a sport. You know what I mean? Like there's a physical component to it. So if I don't take care of my body, I'm essentially, the way I see it, not doing my job, right? My job is to coach jujitsu. I got to make sure that I'm physically capable of doing that. So I've got to make sure that I'm taking care of my body. So that's like a shift in my thinking that was big.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You've gone the right way about it. Rather than trying to get the world's biggest bench and be a good jiu-jitsu player, it's more about evening out what you're doing. If you do 1,000 pulls in a grappling session, do you need to go and do 1,000 more pulls in the gym? Maybe not. That might be the day to do, some press variations and kind of even stuff out just from a prehab kind of perspective. You mentioned grip training there as well. I mean, I don't know about you, Rob, but I've been playing around with daily hangs, accruing anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes a day on my rings just here on my balcony, just for shoulder health, basically. But I noticed as a byproduct of that, even though I'm gripping the rings in like what you might call a low bar grip fashion, where my hand is almost open, I'm not false gripping, but I'm just hanging by my fingers. I've noticed a massive carryover into grip strength. In fact, my captains of crush number 2 here is now nearly closable, which is really great, and I never thought that would I never thought I'd see the day. What kind of grip stuff do you find that works really well, and do you do it from like a suspension kind of idea, or do you do it with like hand over hand pulls, or what works for you on that front?
So most of the grip stuff that I do is connected with other things. So for instance, like one of my favorites is I really love hex bar and Romanian deadlifts, and I try to also factor in like the grip, right? I'm grabbing it, and after the last set, I'll try to like hold for an extra like 30 seconds. I'll just hold it, and then I'll put it down. The only like grip specific things that I do, I actually have heard of the hangs as a grip training exercise, and I'll probably incorporate that in the future. I don't know if you know, Danaher is actually a big fan of that. Danaher loves hanging for forearm strength.
Right.
But yeah, for me, the only ones that I do is I take 2 small weights that you put on like a barbell, right? And I'll pinch them together, and I'll hold that for like 30 seconds or a minute or something. I'll do that, and then I also like I don't know what it's called. It's like a bar, and at the bottom is the weight, and you pull it up.
Wrist roller, yeah, on the variations on wrist roller, yeah, I know the one.
Yeah, like I like that too.
Yeah, that's great.
I've made one myself out of one of my brother's lacrosse sticks.
Cool.
So.
That's cool. Yeah, you can make it on the end of a barbell as well. If your barbell's bearing, you can just tie a piece of rope and just twist the barbell. That works, and you can just have the barbell in the rack. That's really good. I've seen that before. That's a nice DIY version. Dan Strauss, not the Bellator fighter, but the British jiu-jitsu player. He's got a really interesting Instagram on grip-based stuff. Some stuff I saw on his account was he was talking about, if you think about how an arm grips another forearm or wrist, that's a specific kind of grip. And he had made some really interesting kind of dowel-based hanging instruments, basically, for lack of a better term, thick dowels type that you have to grip on and then hang for time, which is quite cool. And another one is your pinch grip that you mentioned there, like pinch grip farmer's walk. So just walking with 2 45-pound plates or whatever it is you want to do, and combining that into a loaded carry. That's a real nice one. I found that has come into like real good carryovers, real good gains on the grip side of things. Yeah, it's a fascinating wormhole. You get these guys that go real deep, and they're into all like the phone book tearing and the card tearing and stuff. And when you look at arm wrestlers as well, you look at that kind of world, and you can glean some really interesting ideas on sort of what I would call maybe compound grip training. So your grip is getting worked, but other stuff, like you mentioned, you're combining it into something else. So you're getting the best use of your time, really. Because I find if you just train grip purely for grip on top of a pull-based sport, you can get actual overuse injuries quite easily with like tendonitis and golfers and elbow swells and stuff like that. Whereas if you combine it more into, like you do, like the 30-second ISO hold on the back end of your deadlift set, well, you've got your deadlifting benefits there, and then you're just getting that grip extra bit as a finisher, and there's no real risk of overuse there, which is
Yeah.
pretty cool. Yeah, it's really interesting. Do you structure your training then based on your strength coaches does it change for when you're off season and then when you're competing? Is it programmed out for you, that kind of thing?
Not right now. So I definitely will do that as more. So basically, I spoke to Danaher about this once a while ago. He said only change your training for important events. So if you have a small local stuff, don't worry about it. You know what I mean? Like, he's even of the belief, even if you lose at the small local thing, he's like, who gives a shit? You know, whatever. It's just you're doing the small local things. You're doing that just to get better. You know what I mean? Because I said to him once, what if I lift and I'm sore and then I go and I lose? He goes, who cares? It doesn't matter. You know, it's the things that matter. That's all you care. That's all you should care about. Right? I mean, you should care. You know what I mean? But it's not the end of the world. People place too much priority on like, why am I doing a small local event? It's just for experience. You know what I mean? Nobody gives a shit. If I win a Naga tournament, nobody gives a fuck. You know what I mean? It's just for my own experience. So, yeah. But on the topic of overtraining, it's funny. I had yesterday, the day before, I had lifted very hard. I'd squatted, deadlifted, like I pushed it pretty hard. I think I overtrained that day, and because I also really like it. Like I actually genuinely enjoy it now. It's like, I'm basically like I'm like a new white belt in strength training. You know what I mean? Like I'm so excited about it.
Yeah, cool.
So like the next day when I was rolling, I was like, oh my God, my fucking back. I think I had squatted too much. Yeah. So like, yeah, but so I'm learning to balance those things out right now.
Yeah, for sure. Load management is massive, and that comes with experience. In my experience, with my own training, obviously managing soreness is it's partly to do with your programming for sure, but it's also partly to do with just how you respond to training. Are you slow twitch? Are you fast twitch? Like what kind of fiber type are you? Where do you kind of sit on that spectrum? And there's quite a few variables there, but over time you'll learn. Okay, if I do training in this kind of format, I'm going to be so fucking sore. I need to space out for a week. Or if I do training in this format, I'll actually be a tiny bit stiff and a tiny bit sore. But if I do a good warm up the next day, I'll be able to train. And yeah, it's very that they call the kind of the programming is kind of a science, but it's also an art actually. And the science is like maybe the spreadsheet in front of you, but the art is actually the day-to-day implementation of it, so that you're not too buggered to then go and do your actual sport. The strength coach kind of thing is making your athletes so sore they can't do their sport, right? In fact, in most circles, you get fired if you did that in the professional circuit. So you have to kind of balance that out. But on your own journey, yeah, it's very interesting to find out what makes you sore and what format. Dorian Yates was a big fan of, he was more in the bodybuilding realm, so it's different, but he talked a lot about using soreness to your advantage, that when you do get it, he used to actually color in on an anatomical chart exactly the muscle fibers that were sore from the specific exercise. So he'd say, I don't know, he did a specific tricep extension on the cable, for example, and he know it would hit the teardrop part of the tricep. So he'd color that in and color code that to tricep extension. So he knew if he needed to hit that muscle again and to grow it, that was his goal, was obviously hypertrophy, but he could grow it by looking at his reference, basically his coloring book, and he could see right exactly which fibers to hit. Now, that's more in the hypertrophy realm of growing muscle, which is probably one element of sport performance that isn't as important as maybe making someone absolutely strong or relatively strong. But it's an interesting kind of tip that I've thought that actually you can use soreness to your advantage if you're specifically trying to target a lagging muscle group, for example, because your squat numbers aren't going up anymore, or you've plateaued, and you can really dial in on maybe some muscle growth specifically in the lower back or in VMO or whatever it is, and you can bring that up. It's quite an interesting method.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. Dorian Yates, I've heard him on the Joe Rogan podcast talk about his bodybuilding experience, and what I liked about it was clear that it was a very super organized, systematic thing.
Yes,
he kept a training journal for every session, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I'm not even that organized. I do my best. We have my students here and we have a Google Drive that we're sharing, where every day we're recording some of our roles, we're archiving the lessons, we're anything we come up with. Like last night I idea about some grips in 50-50. And I was like, oh, let's experiment with this. I recorded it, put it down, we upload it so everybody can see it, and then you keep a running archive. So similar to what Dorian Yates was doing with the journal. And I really love that idea. I think that's brilliant for like writing down, coloring the where you feel sore. I think that's fucking really, really smart, especially for a bodybuilder.
Yeah, progressive. That's ahead of its time. You could argue that that's the running joke that that's why he's a meathead in the first place. He sticks to coloring by numbers, but it actually works. It's a good method. Yeah, very interesting. I wanted to just pick your brains lastly, Rob. I know you're going to go and get some training in, so I don't want to keep you too much longer. But I'm quite interested in this idea as jiu-jitsu as a model for living as much as, or martial arts in general, but specifically jiu-jitsu. Not just a sport, not just a hobby, not just a pastime, but actually as a model for being somewhat a better person. Now, it's been said by people much more experienced and advanced than me that jiu-jitsu doesn't really make you a better person per se, but it gives you a power. And it's up to you whether you want to use that power to be a better person or more of a dickhead. Do you consider yourself to be more of a competitor, a martial artist, or somebody that uses jiu-jitsu to kind of navigate life? And if you do use jiu-jitsu to navigate life, what is it that you learn on the mats that you transfer to kind of having a better quality of life?
Yeah. So it's very interesting because I think that ultimately you can't think of yourself as just, well, you can, but I think it's not a good idea to think of yourself as only a competitor or only a coach whose goal is to develop competitors. Because pretty soon that devolves into like, I literally think that basically is a pyramid scheme. Like if you think about it, like think about it. Imagine if your goal as a coach is to just develop other competitors, and what's their goal? It's going to be to develop other competitors. Well, within 7, maybe not even that many, maybe within like a couple of generations, there's nobody left on the planet, right? Like, everyone's a competitor, right? Like, so it's like I don't think you can just focus on the competitive aspect. In my opinion, I mean, I guess like I think of myself as a martial artist. So one time I was talking to Danaher, and we were talking about what we did, and he specifically said the term the martial arts, right? And I think it's interesting because like, so I don't really think of much of what I'm doing as being like, I'm not planning on using what I'm doing in a fight. You know what I mean? Like jiu-jitsu to me, I mean, to me, it's a sport, but it's a sport that it's not just about the competitive element. Competition is important. In my opinion, competition is only important insofar as it helps us to achieve the broader goal of jiu-jitsu. And I think the broader goal of jiu-jitsu, I actually said this on my story, my Instagram stories a little while ago. If you think about it, the only purpose of jiu-jitsu is to make your life better. If it's not doing that, you're not achieving the main goal of jiu-jitsu. And I think that you've always got to be asking yourself that as you're training, is this making my life better? And that doesn't mean making your life like easier, or it doesn't even mean like, is it fun? It means, is this adding value to my life? And I think that first of all, you got to ask that for yourself. And second of all, you got to ask that for your students. Am I adding value? Am I making my students' lives better? You know, and sometimes that might mean asking them to do things they don't want to do, right? Sometimes we don't know the short term and the long term sometimes clash. And ultimately, I think choosing the long term is probably better, right? What jiu-jitsu can do for us, I think, is it gives us a very clear path. There's a lack of ambiguity in jiu-jitsu, whereas in other areas of life, there's like a lot of ambiguity, right? Like trying to know what to choose to do with your life can be a very complicated thing. And there's so much, like there's a quote by a Danish philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard that I love. He said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He said, and obviously I'm saying the English translation, I don't know Danish, but so he said, like, life can only be understood looking back, but it can only be lived going forwards, right? Think about that. That's kind of existentially terrifying. But jiu-jitsu, but the valuable thing about jiu-jitsu is, in a sense, it's an area of life where a lot of the ambiguity is removed. I think this is why it's so addicting to people. Like people, whether they recognize it or not, they want to have purpose in life. And jiu-jitsu, as silly as it might sound, I think it can give us purpose. Now, I think what we have to do is we have to be careful to not let it go too far, because I think that if you become too obsessed with jujitsu, you can start to fall. There's a lot of traps you can fall into, thinking like, oh, if someone's good at jujitsu, they're a good person, and that is not true whatsoever. The way I've described it in the past is that think of jujitsu as being a way to improve yourself. Now, that self-improvement can manifest as very isolated self-improvement, or it can manifest as self-improvement that extends to everywhere in your life, right? So if you imagine somebody who's absolutely miserable in their life. Is it easy to be a good person like that? I mean, it can be tough, right? But if you have something in your life that gives you purpose and direction, and every day you have this physical outlet, you're feeling like that endorphin rush of training, and on top of that, you have an intellectual stimulation, and on top of that, again, you have like the purpose it adds to your life. You have all these things. It gives you this really tremendous benefit, and I think that can extend itself to other areas of your life where now you're like, you maybe have a shit day at work, you go to training, you feel better afterwards, you're capable of sort of approaching the rest of your life better. I think it's very difficult, maybe even impossible as a coach, to directly translate so many of these ideas. When you say them, it kind of waters them down in terms of like teaching them to a student, right? So it's got to kind of come implicitly, you know what I mean? It's got to come without saying, right? But I think that these values, they can come through jujitsu. It's more about how you carry yourself as a coach, how you structure the room. Are you allowing reckless training? Are you allowing disrespect? Like, I think it's, so I'm not going to say any names, obviously. I had a student who's pretty good, disrespect a student who was not very good, said some unkind things, and I cut that shit off very fast. I said, that's not accept talk like that. I don't care. I don't care if you're better at jiu-jitsu than that guy is still a training partner. We need him. You need him. You know what I mean? You could not get better without him. So I don't tolerate that sort of thing. Yeah. And I hope that translates to other areas of life as well. I have a belief as a coach that you have to like monitor your students a lot when it comes to those sorts of things, because I personally don't want to teach to people who are assholes. Because I think jiu-jitsu is, I've only ever kicked one person out of a class. No, that's not true. I've kicked two people out of a class before. One of them was a white guy saying a racial slur. I was like, dude, you cannot be here. This is like, come on. That's in New York City, right? Like, there's a lot of, New York is a very diverse city. Like, man, you can't be saying that stuff. And the second one was a similar thing. I didn't even let him in the class. The guy showed up and he was a known neo-Nazi. He had a swastika tattooed on him. And I was like, dude, absolutely not. Like, you cannot take my class.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So like, and what was the purpose of doing that? In both situations, it's because first of all, the way I see it, I'm teaching you how to physically injure other people. I don't want to teach someone like that who has some very evil, in my opinion, very evil views. The white kid who was saying the racial slurs, I know him. He's just sort of like a punk. He's not really like a bad kid. He's just sort of like, he like being naughty is funny, right? Like, so it's like, I told him, don't say it again. He said it again. I told him to get out, and he came back. He never did it again. So it wasn't a problem, right? But the neo-Nazi, he's more of an issue. Right? Imagine if I taught that guy over a year of training how to injure people.
Wow. Yeah.
I don't want that responsibility. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's not okay. So you've got to, I'm kind of like ranting a little bit, but like there is a connection between jiu-jitsu and life, but I don't think it's as simple as good at jiu-jitsu, good at life. There's many facets to this. I think as coaches, we have to be thinking, are we making our students' lives better? And that's what we should be doing, but you're not, it's kind of complicated. You're not doing that in a way that's like, you can't, like at the end of the day, you're not their parents. You know what I mean? Like, you're their coach. So you've got to do it sort of a subconscious way. I think that makes any sense. Yeah,
kind of by example. And I think maybe what you're trying to say, Rob, is, and this is in the strength coaching world, massive, especially with team sports, is you're creating a culture in your gym. You're creating a specific culture. And if that culture is positive and it has a positive feedback into people's outside extracurricular life, fantastic. But if it doesn't, who cares? At least when they're inside that culture, it's beneficial. And I think a coach's kind of responsibility, or at least if you consider yourself to be a good coach, is you create a culture and an environment where it's okay to fail, it's encouraging, and there's a whole list of like really wholesome cultural ideas there that you've established in an environment that hopefully by osmosis leaks into everybody's daily life and kind of boosts it up a notch. Which is, I think, a massive responsibility, but also fantastic. Like that you could even have that effect on someone's sort of regular life off the mat. I think it's powerful. Last little bit before I let you go, big man. One of my training partners is big on understanding the mental side of competition. He's a good grappler and has competed a lot. You sometimes struggle with the mental side of things.
Right.
Do you think mental preparation is important before competing? And if so, what kind of approaches do you take to prepare yourself mentally so that the best Rob can come out when you're competing?
Yeah. So a lot of people don't like my response to this, but it's born out of a lot of experience. I do not think mental preparation is remotely helpful whatsoever. Maybe it is for some people. It might be, right? If you have experimented with it and it's worked for you, by all means, right? This is a very subjective, you're talking about like programming, strength training. Obviously, it's a science, but also an art. I think this is even more of an art, right? It's very personal, right? Like I don't really do this too much anymore, but in my early competition days, I had a routine. I sort of fell out of it, but it helped me early on to deal with the nerves, to have some structure to my warm up and such. But like, in my opinion, the only thing that's going to help you get used to competing is just competing more. And in addition, it's like exposure therapy. The more you do it, the more used to it you get. There's a couple things that go with that. Now, you cannot just think competing alone is going to remove your anxiety, because it's not. First of all, some people will never get rid of their competition anxiety. So Danaher told me the story of George St. Pierre. He said George St. Pierre never got rid of his competition anxiety, and he always had it. Whereas Gordon Ryan, by contrast, not so much, right? Not quite as nervous a guy. So it doesn't. It's just you got to kind of recognize yourself for who you are. And so one time I spoke to him about, I have competition anxiety, and I was like, I said to him, I was like, is it possible that I don't have the right personality to be a combat sports athlete? And he basically told me to like cut that shit off, stop being a little bitch. And like what he was basically saying is like, anyone can be a champion, because it's not about what's inside, it's about what you do. It's about what you express on the mats. You could be freaking out inside. If you go out there and you perform well, who cares? You got the job done, right? That's what matters. Now, of course, how you feel internally can affect what you do externally, right? But ultimately, it's a fool's errand to try to control what's going on inside. Because you can't. We start to panic as human beings when we try to control things that can't be controlled, right? It's very natural. But when you focus on what you can control and you let go of what you can't, look, you might have anxiety. You got to just let go of that, because you can't control it. But what you can control is what you do out there. I'm not saying you can control the results. I'm not saying that. But you could control your performance. You could control, did you go out there and give it your all? Did you stick to the game plan? Did you have a game plan? Did you drill properly? Did you study enough? Did you do proper research? Those are things that are within your control. And that's what you've got to do. In my opinion, that's the best way to lower competition anxiety, by going out there and knowing you've done your homework, right? In addition, the second thing is you've got to take what you're doing seriously. So I see a lot of competitors fall into this trap where they go, I'm just going to keep competing and the anxiety will go away. And then they lose some, they win some, and they don't really take it that seriously. Well, if you're not taking it that seriously, your results are not going to be that serious. If you just expect the competition anxiety to just go away magically, it's not going to happen. The only way to think, like, I went to a tournament once and I was driving there, and there wasn't anyone big in the tournament. It was a fairly small event. There were people there. I had maybe like 5 matches that day, but nobody super high level. There were some black belts, there were some brown belts, but again, nobody like elite, right? And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I wasn't nervous. It was like one of the first times I'd never not been nervous. And I thought to myself, logically, I would actually be dumb to think I wasn't going to win. And that's not arrogance. That was born out of experience and results. I had been winning a lot. At that point, I think I'd won like 25 matches in a row. This is a smaller event. There was nobody there who should have been a stiff challenge to me. And lo and behold, no one was. I won. And it was, the value of that was, I think maybe the first time ever that I didn't have a ton of nerves. And it was, that was something that just like, emerged naturally out of the process of competing a lot, and it was, and because I had been doing my homework and I've been doing what I needed to do beforehand, right? Like, if I had been losing constantly, do you think I would have gone into that tournament thinking that? No. And I would have been an idiot for thinking that, right? You see guys who lose constantly and they think, the next one's going to be my big breakthrough. And it's like, why? Did you do anything different than you did the first 10 times? No. If you changed your approach, possibly it will be the big breakthrough. But you see people, they do the same thing over and over again, and it produces bad results. What I'm saying is, basically, don't worry about it. You can't control it. Let go of it. Focus on the result, not even the results, sorry. Focus on your performance. And then over time, as your good performance leads to better results, that will lead naturally to confidence. To me, that's the only real way to do it. I think that trying to focus on controlling your nerves, man, I've seen it. I've tried it a lot, actually. I tried all the different sports psychology tactics, right? And I know I have friends who it's worked for, actually. So at the end of the day, if it works for you, don't fucking listen to me. Do what's working for you. This is just my opinion.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Very interesting. I think you're right. I think it falls into the category of does it work for you or not, whether it's you believe it will work for you or don't, or maybe it's a personality type thing. I'm not quite sure. My last guest on the show is a mental coach to UFC fighters, and he works with them. But what he did say, which is the same as what you just said there, is basically you're focusing on your performance and what you want to have happen, not what you don't want to have happen. And
Right.
Interestingly, you try and control your nerves. They're like a slippery bar of soap, and it's like it doesn't. Your willpower doesn't have any correlation to controlling them because it's the environment that's bringing out the nerves in the first place. You'd be much better off focusing on your game plan and executing that than trying to control the slippery nerves. Yeah, very fascinating. Rob, where people want to get hold of you, kind of figure out like your instructionals, follow you on Instagram, YouTube, and all that stuff, where can they find you, mate?
So best place is I would start on my Instagram because that's where I'm most active. It's Robert Degle BJJ, Robert Degle BJJ, and then from there I have a link to my website where you can get my instructionals. And then if you search the same thing on YouTube, you'll also find my YouTube channel. I have the same name, so there you
Fantastic. Go. Yeah, I encourage everyone to get onto the Instagram because you post some really interesting stuff actually on your stories, but also your YouTube channel. It changed my training. I had a torn bicep just before Christmas, and going back to training was difficult, but drilling was possible. And your YouTube channel was a massive influence on my progression. And as I explained to you just before the call, I hit one of your modified crab ride moves today in sparring. Nice. So thanks to you for that. Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Thank you so much for taking some time out over there, Singapore, coming on the show. It's just been absolutely brilliant. I'd love to get you back on again, actually. I've got a whole stack of questions I could talk to you for hours about.
Yeah, no doubt. Let's do it.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you so much. And I hope training goes well in the next couple of hours with one of your students. And I look forward to getting you back on soon, mate.
Thanks, definitely. See you later, man.
This episode of the Move Mind podcast was brought to you by CBD Mountain, for sport and fitness CBD. Head over to cbdmountain.com for a range of soft gels, skin balms, oils and vapes, and purchase online and have the premium quality CBD delivered directly to your door. cbdmountain.com